avant-garde artists of the 20th century, such as Pablo Picasso, André Derain, Maurice de Vlaminck, and Henri Matisse, gravitated towards African art and used it as a guide to change their individual styles. In a paradoxical way, Europeans saw African peoples and their art as simple and savage, but found the magical hold it had over them. What is it specifically about African art that was so enchanting to Europeans? And how were European artists exposed to African art and imitated? Hello and welcome everybody to my channel. I am Dean Easy, and if you enjoyed today's video, please like and subscribe. Support small YouTubers. Now let's get into the video. African art possesses certain qualities that other non-Western art does not. For starters, African pieces stay true to the material used to make them. They were usually made out of wood and involved direct carving onto the material. Furthermore, African art does not stay true to realistic body proportions. According to Matisse, African art sticks, quote, to invented planes and proportions, unquote, which is what avant-garde artists imitated to break out of the norm. A commonality among African statues are legs that are small in proportion to the body and have bent knees. Depending on the art piece, certain facial features are exaggerated in both masks and statues. The Fang mask, first owned by Vlaminck and then Derain, is one artifact responsible for these artists finding beauty in African art. Made out of painted wood, the mask features thin eyebrows, small almond-shaped eyes, and a thin mouth with tiny teeth. All are contrasted with a long but slender nose that protrudes from the mask. Vlaminck, among other artists, later appropriated the mask in the faces of the women painted in bathers. In this painting, Vlaminck connects the two eyebrows and the elongated nose while omitting the eyes and the mouth. African sculpture was made for sacred and ritualistic reasons. Reliquary figures especially contain an object of revered individuals and pieces of cranium. They are meant to sit on top of the reliquary as guardians of the deceased. One of the most notable reliquary figures European artists had exposure to is the figure from a reliquary ensemble from Koda culture. Made out of wood with copper beaten into it, it resembles a shovel with eyes and a nose. In the realm of avant-garde European sculpture, there was Constantine Brancusi and Amedeo Modigliani, whose styles are indebted to African influences. Prior to his exposure to African art in 1910, Brancusi's work conformed essentially to European ideas of naturalism. During his African-looking period, Brancusi sculpted his portrait of Madame L.R., which resembles a reliquary figure. He omitted the facial features but kept the striations. He also added a body made up of sausage-like cylinders to a rectangular block. The bun of hair attached to the back of the head also adds a sense of humor to the piece. Whereas African art is sacred, Brancusi twists its influence on him as a joke. From the colonial period up to modernity, African art has been viewed as exotic fetishes to anthropological artifacts, and then works of revolutionary art. Europeans would acquire these African works either through confiscation or trade during colonization. These works would end up in flea markets or ethnographic expositions, such as the Trocadero Ethnographic Museum of Paris. And some European artists would go to the museum and draw sketches of what they saw. One such artist was Picasso, who in an interview described the hold African art had over him. He says, "The masks weren't like any other kinds of sculpture. They were magical things. And why weren't they Egyptian or Chaldean pieces? Those were primitive, not magical things. The Negro sculptures were intercessors." African art became revolutionary with artists like Picasso incorporating it into their works. Then art dealers who sold African works and European works with African influence helped push the popularity of it. One such dealer was Paul Guillaume, who sold works of Modigliani. Nova Pilota by Modigliani is a painted portrait of Paul Guillaume where Modigliani refers to Guillaume as a new pilot in organizing African art exhibitions. Guillaume is portrayed in a dark suit and a top hat as a successful businessman. The historical approach of understanding the context of African art and the changes it has undergone during the colonial period is a better method to understand the African influence in European art instead of the approach of using terms such as primitive and making comparisons between the two. In 1984, the Museum of Modern Art showcased an exhibit titled Primitivism in 20th-Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern, that did not address cultural appropriation, and the appropriation is labeled as an affinity, which implies a kinship between Western and non-Western cultures, when in reality, Europeans did not acknowledge the African artists or cultures who made the art with context. Art historian Jonathan Hayes' approach of understanding the history of the crewman people and how colonialism transformed the looks of the masks they made in assimilating to it is a better way of understanding African influence in European art. He explains how the crewman masks were, quote, more plausibly described as paramodern, that is, at once modern and unmodern, never simply one or the other, unquote. Avant-garde artists of the 20th century are also in a sense of paramodern because of their attempt to return to primitivism. Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is an example of the paramodern because only two of the women's faces resemble typical human faces, while the other three women on the sides have faces inspired by African and Oceanic face masks. Because it is difficult to pinpoint the actual mask that inspired Picasso in his painting, Picasso was able to study the characteristics of such masks and imagine his own versions of them. In conclusion, European art was dead by 1905 and needed a rebirth. It was through the discovery of African art that avant-garde artists of the 20th century reshaped their imaginations. The qualities of African masks and statues that appeal to European artists are the disproportions, exaggerations, and different existing planes. Colonization of Africa allowed for African art to be introduced to a new audience through ethnographic museums and flea markets. In African artists adapting to colonization and European artists' new-found appropriation of African art, 20th century art exists on the spectrum between primitive and modern. Because of this, African art has changed from being mere fetishes to revolutionary pieces of art. So in my opinion, the reputation of savagery that African art has is invalid. You have heard my opinions on the whole situation. I want to hear yours. And did I get my pronunciations correct? Please leave a comment down below, and I will see you in the next video.